What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mike Dolce Show. Today, we are talking about the squared circle meeting the octagon. Jake Paul might, I got some inside information on this one, by the way, so make sure you stay here and listen. Hear me out here. Jake Paul has been in conversation with none other than Anderson, this spider, Silva, UFC pound for pound conversation GOAT, Anderson Silva versus Jake Paul in a boxing match. That is the conversation that is happening right now. Aggressive negotiations are happening at this very moment. No fight has been finalized, but this fight may happen as early as October, which is 2 months away. Now, let me share a story briefly. I want to share a story from MMA Junkie, but then I want to give you the secret sauce that you have not heard yet. Briefly, MMAJunkie.com. Thank you. Jake Paul versus Anderson Silva boxing match booked for October. Well, not quite yet. And they go on to say that TMZ later confirmed with their sources that the fight has been made, but didn't specify a date. Neither TMZ nor No Smoke Boxing reported a location or venue. Paul's company, Most Valuable Promotions, teased his next fight over the weekend on Twitter, saying he, meaning Jake Paul, almost certainly will be the underdog. Now, Paul, this is important. Pay attention here. Jake Paul, who's only 25 years old, is 5-0 as a professional boxer. He knocked out former Bellator welterweight world champion, former ONE FC welterweight world champion, Ben Askren. He then goes on to twice beat five-time UFC welterweight world champion Tyron Woodley. One time, he knocked Woodley out by knockout. This is the most recent fight, and that was his December 2021 sixth-round knockout of Woodley. Paul has faced questions about his legitimacy as a boxer. I don't agree with that statement right there. And then Anderson Silva, who won 2 boxing matches in 2021. First, Anderson Silva beat Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., a legitimate former boxing world champion, son of the legendary Julio Cesar Chavez. And Anderson Silva knocked out Tito the Can Ortiz, former UFC light heavyweight world champion, like decades ago, right around the time Jesus Christ was walking the planet, is when Tito Ortiz was relevant in MMA and the UFC, but it's still on the record, and we will give him that. Now, let me share some of the special sauce here. Jake Paul, 25 years old, 5-0 as a legitimate boxer, having knocked out 2 former world champion combat athletes in Tyron Woodley, 5-time UFC welterweight world champion, Ben Askren, who was regarded as the #1 welterweight on the planet for a period of time during his Bellator and ONE FC run, which is why the UFC brought Ben Askren in, and eventually Robbie Lawler and Jorge Masvidal were able to start to expose a little bit about what Ben was bringing to the table. But I digress. I want to now ask you, why do you think Jake Paul is in conversation to fight Anderson Silva? Now, don't forget, Anderson Silva, who's 47 years old, is 6'2", which is considerably taller than Jake Paul. Anderson Silva has 45 MMA bouts under his name. Anderson Silva at one time held the record for most consecutive title defenses inside the UFC. Anderson Silva, who's considered to be one of the GOATs, the greatest of all time in MMA, one of the UFC's most storied and feared champions. Why would Jake Paul, a 5-0 young boxer, want to challenge Anderson Silva, who's coming off 2 decisive wins in boxing, one of which he beat Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., the other of which he knocked out a former UFC champion in Tito Ortiz. On paper, Jake Paul is the underdog. This does not sound like a good matchup. But when you peel back that onion just a little bit, what do we see? Well, let me show you here. We see this. Well, this is Anderson Silva's SureDog bio. Okay? And in this, it shows Anderson Silva's 34 wins in his career, an MMA career, and only 11 losses. That's a great ratio. But when we look back over recent years, what do we see? Well, we see a lot of red here, right? We see a lot of red. What does this mean? This means Anderson Silva has had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 losses out of his last 9 fights in the UFC, one of which was a no contest to Nick Diaz. Now, let me explain this again. Anderson Silva inside the UFC, he lost to Chris Weidman in 2013. He lost again. Now, I should say he was knocked out by Chris Weidman in 2013. He broke his leg and lost to Chris Weidman again in 2013, 6 months later. He then went out and had a lackluster performance against Nick Diaz, which was turned to no contest. Then he goes out and he loses a decision to Bisping. He loses a decision to Daniel Cormier. He beats Derek Brunson, who's a good, talented fighter, but he's a top 10 guy. He's not a top 5, not a top 3 guy, not a world champion. He gets a decision against Derek Brunson. He goes out and he gets smoked by Israel Adesanya. He goes out, he gets smoked by Jared Cannonier. And he goes out and he gets finished by Uriah Hall. So if I'm Jake Paul, if I'm Nikisa, if I'm a part of Team Jake Paul, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, you know what? This Anderson Silva guy, well, boy, his best days are far behind him, but his name and his legend shines much brighter than his athletic prowess. This is what I'm going to think. What do you guys think? Leave your comments below. I want to hear what you think. Anderson Silva has 1 win and 7 losses at the end of his UFC career. He won 1 time versus a journeyman and lost 7 other times against good and not so good competition. Uriah Hall, who's a friend of mine, Uriah Hall has never sniffed title contention. As much as I love Uriah Hall was barely a top 10er. Jared Cannonier, all right. He got to the top of a weaker pack. Israel Adesanya is excellent, but Israel got smoked when he moved up to 205. Derek Brunson, yeah, all right. He's got to win against Derek. Derek's tough. Daniel Cormier, no shame in that. Michael Bisping, all right. He held the title, one and done. Bisping's tough guy. Not bashing on Weidman. So it's not like Anderson was losing to scrubs. He was losing to all legitimate, from Uriah all the way through to DC. But he was lost. He lost. And boy, I tell you something. Losing is contagious. Does Jake Paul feel that Anderson Silva's best days are behind him like I feel? I think Anderson's amazing. I love Anderson Silva, all that he is and represents. I'm a big fan of Anderson, who he is as a martial artist. And I competed against Anderson Silva when I worked with Vitor Belfort. I competed against Anderson Silva when I worked with Chael Sonnen. I know Anderson and his team deeply, behind the scenes, like you guys do not know. I have been behind the scenes, in the locker room, in the negotiation room, in the octagon, across the octagon from Anderson Silva multiple times in my own storied career. So I share this information, not just as a pundit, like many on here are. I'm the 4-time world MMA trainer of the year. I have been behind the scenes in the UFC since the late 90s. Since before Dana White and the Fertittas bought the UFC, I was working with UFC athletes. So I know this game pretty damn well. Anderson Silva brings so much to the table for Jake Paul. The risk to reward ratio, risk to reward, or I should say risk to reward, relatively low risk, because think about it like this. Jake Paul goes out there. Let's say Jake loses to Anderson Silva. Well, it's Anderson Silva, one of the greatest of all time. Anderson's beat so many other great athletes with much better records than Jake Paul has right now. Is that really a loss? But if Jake goes out there and beats Anderson Silva, which I believe, I'll go on record right now and say, Jake Paul, he is the sleeping dog in this. Jake Paul, in my book, has a better chance of beating Anderson Silva than Anderson does of beating Jake. For a multitude of reasons. But reason number one is naivete. Jake Paul at 25 years old, 5-0, he's still going to come out there like a fucking bull. He's going to come out there with nothing to lose. And do not get it twisted. Jake Paul is a hard training athlete. Jake Paul is a stud. Jake Paul is a savage. I wish I could have taken Jake Paul's soul and implanted it into some of the much more renowned athletes I've worked with through the years. If I could take Jake Paul's mentality and put that into the bodies of some of the athletes I've worked with over the last 20 plus years, you'd see a hell of a lot more world champions with that attitude alone. So I think Jake Paul has the mentality, he has the viciousness, the ferocity, and the physicality to go out there and smoke Anderson, who is not immune from getting knocked out. Anderson's got knocked out quite a few times now. He's been finished quite a few times now. He's lost many times now. Jake Paul's never sniffed defeat. Jake Paul knocked out Tyron Woodley, the 5-time UFC world champion, who everyone will agree Tyron Woodley had a harder punch than Anderson Silva. Anderson Silva was great with kicks, great with knees, great with elbows. His punching, very accurate, great volume like the Diaz brothers. But Anderson Silva was not a one-punch knockout artist like Tyron Woodley was. Jake Paul smoked Tyron. So, what do you think? Does Jake beat? And number one, does the fight happen? Number two, is this the good fight for Jake Paul? Number three, who wins and why? Leave that below, my friends. Also, check the links below. Check out all of our amazing sponsors. There is something down there for you. I guarantee it. Until next time, boom.